This morning is the fourth part of an ongoing sermon series that I've been doing on founding mothers of Unitarian Universalism. 3 years ago, we focused on Margaret Fuller, who along with Emerson and Thoreau is one of our three most important transcendentalist forebears. Her 1845 pamphlet, Women in the 19th Century, was the first significant work to take the liberal side of the question of women's rights since the day of Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Women 50 years earlier. Fuller was also America's first foreign war correspondent, and tragically she died in a shipwreck on her trip home from Europe when she was only 40 years old. 2 years ago, we reflected on the lives of the Peabody sisters. Mary Peabody, an important educator in her own right, who married the politician and educational reformer Horace Mann, as well as Sophia Peabody, a talented painter who married Nathaniel Hawthorne, a novelist whose best-known work is The Scarlet Letter. And finally, Elizabeth Peabody, the author and translator of a half dozen books, who also became the publisher of Nathaniel Hawthorne, William Ellery Channing, Theodore Parker, and Margaret Fuller, under her own imprint. She was also the celebrated founder of kindergartens in America. Last year, we explored the life of Julia Ward Howe, who, in the words of one of her biographers, had 6 children, learned 6 languages, and published 6 books. She was most famous for writing the lyrics to the Battle Hymn of the Republic. She was also president of the New England Women's Suffrage Association and helped found Mother's Day for her famous Mother's Day proclamation for peace, even though Hallmark later took over and co-opted her vision, and Danny read earlier Howe's original words. In future years, I look forward to telling you some about others of our founding mothers, such as Judith Sargent Murray, an early American advocate for women's rights, who was married to John Murray, the founder of the Universalist half of our UU heritage. Olympia Brown, another Universalist, who in 1863 became the first woman in any religious movement to be ordained with full denominational recognition. And Sophia Lyon-Fahs, who revolutionized 20th century UU religious education, as well as many others. I have plenty of incredible women lined up to do many Mother's Day sermons to come. And in these history-based sermons, my intent is not to overwhelm you with names and dates. Rather, my baseline hope is that your takeaway will be that as Unitarian Universalists, we stand on the shoulders of giants, many of whom were path-breaking women. It's important to retell these stories from our history that we might continue to inscribe them onto our sense of self, of who we are, allowing the lives of our ancestors to inspire us to live with more courage, more freedom, more compassion in our own time. This year, our focus is Mary Moody Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson's aunt, whom he called his earliest and his best teacher. I'll be drawing from a landmark biography written in 1998 by the English and Women's Studies professor Phyllis Cole, who helped further raise awareness of Mary's influence on Waldo's life. I'll be following her choice of breaking with the scholarly convention of referring to Ralph Waldo by his last name, Emerson, and then Aunt Mary only in relationship to him, and I will instead, for the purposes of this sermon, be referring to both of them by their family names, by Waldo and Mary. Relatedly, I realized recently that I never ended up preaching a sermon on Ralph Waldo Emerson. I thought I had. What I was remembering was lecturing about him at Wesley Seminary, and so I will, because I had planned to preach a sermon, and then because of a confluence of circumstances, it got delayed, and I planned to reschedule it, and apparently didn't. So I will plan to preach a sermon on him in the next year. But it is equally significant that a full generation before Waldo's early manifestos, Mary's almanac was claiming a life of solitude and an experience of God through nature and the imagination. Her letters then formed the matrix of his thought, both early in life and through the years of his landmark literary utterance. However, prior to the influence of second-wave feminism, which started in the 1960s and then created a new generation of scholars in the late 70s and into the 80s, which included Phyllis Cole and led to a revolution in women's studies, Mary's influence on Waldo had not been extensively explored. People just sort of mentioned it, but had not gone into depth or detail. Emerson himself partially acknowledged his intellectual debt to his aunt, but the full depth of his debt has become increasingly apparent in recent studies of Mary's almanac, her decades-long personal journal, which was begun at age 20. The almanac was thought lost or destroyed, but in 1981, Dr. Cole recovered it in a box of uncatalogued family papers in the Harvard Library. It is constructed from letter paper and bound with thread. The almanacs are these handmade booklets running to over 1,000 pages in some cases. They display multiple genres, including letters, spiritual diaries, original compositions. Their content, however, consists largely of commonplace book quotations from her commentary on her extensive readings over her lifetime. And although Mary did publish some essays during her lifetime, these miscellaneous almanacs represent her most experimental expressions as a writer, which are some of the ones that influenced Waldo the most. So she often shared pieces of this almanac with her friends, so before she would bind them up with string, she would mail them out, she would allow people to borrow them, and then she'd collect them. And there are even periodic notes in the almanac to quote, "To any nephew who may read this." Her almanacs are in the process of being published online in digital editions, so you can already begin to view them. Now, Waldo's own extensive journals include significant sections in which he transcribed significant portions of letters from Mary and excerpts from her almanac that he let her borrow. Indeed, there are many occasions in which we have evidence of him begging her for more of her almanacs for him to look at. And in 1837, the year after he published his breakthrough essay in Nature, he listed Mary in his journal, not publicly, but in his journal, as one of his 7 most vital benefactors. There are also multiple instances in which Emerson published revised versions of Mary's writings. Her writing was often fairly cryptic and fragmentary, even though it was brilliant. So he would often lightly revise it and then publish it without attribution, these little sentences or excerpts. One of the most ironic examples is from a passage in his 1859 essay, Culture, about solitude. So he's writing about the virtues of being alone and the thoughts that you have in solitude, the experiences that you have in solitude, but he was ironically drawing directly from his relationship with his aunt without letting that be known, which is sort of the opposite of solitude. The wisdom was from her direct experience of solitude, not his own. It seems that because Mary had been unwilling or unable to publish a lot of her writing, her words to him did not count as a written text that one had to cite, and were more the category of what he called living wit, like a conversation that was protected by no authorial right that Waldo recognized, even though you've increasingly seen scholars today will cite things like, I owe this to a conversation with this person, but Emerson did not do that. A lot more to say here about how Waldo's writings about self-reliance. Also forgot to mention that he daily depended on his wife, his mother, his 3 servants, and a gardener for his self-reliance. But I'll get to that in a sermon about him. There's also much more to say about Mary's legacy, but before continuing on that track, allow me to share some of the details of her life. She was born in Concord, Massachusetts in 1774, 2 years before the American Revolutionary War. The whole Emerson line comes from the 1630s with the big Puritan immigration to the U.S. Well, not then, right? So to the colonies. To give you only one example of how remarkable her feminist independence was, given the patriarchal house into which and culture to which she was born into, she writes the following as one of her earliest childhood memories. She says, I remember my father punishing me once. I was 2 years old, and when I came into his study, I wouldn't make my curtsy, and so he whipped me. Mother came in and asked, why had he punished me? And he said, because she wouldn't make her duty upon coming into the room, her female duty to curtsy when coming into the room that a older male relative was in. And the mother said, what? Whip a child 2 years old for that? And my father said, my dear, since you have interfered, I must whip her again. And he did. Tragically, Mary's father died the same year as this incident from an illness. Her mother, struggling to care for 5 children, sent her to live with different relatives throughout her childhood. This early distance from her family of origin increased Mary's independence, but it also at times caused her great sorrow and grief. But as Mary began to come into her own, she never expressed romantic interest. She turned down at least 2 enviable marriage proposals. Mary wrote of sick feelings when she thought of getting married. You can make what you will of that. And she stuck to what she called a, quote, permanent vow of non-compliance. She was drawn instead to independence, and although she had only a few months of formal schooling in grammar school, she cultivated a lifelong journey really, of self-directed learning. Fortunately, she had access to an excellent public library and read widely, including many cutting-edge books on theological liberalism. She also loved poetry, particularly Milton and Wordsworth. To give you just a taste of her writing style, and she wrote the following about her favorite poets. I'll try to break this down. Her writing is really difficult to follow, period. It's particularly difficult to follow orally. She writes that solitude, so the point of this paragraph is wrestling with the value of solitude. She says, solitude which to people not talented to deviate, right? People with not enough talent to deviate from the norm. That solitude allows you to deviate from the beaten track, which she says parenthetically that the beaten track is the safeguard of mediocrity. And she says, those not talented to do so without offending is to learning and talents the only sure labyrinth. So she said, if you're not really able to just naturally do it, solitude can give you that labyrinth, like we have out here between the sanctuary and the chapel, that labyrinth to allow you to spin down and to experience something differently. Though she says parenthetically, though sometimes gloomy, that process. And it enables you to form eagle's wings, which will bear one farther than suns and stars. So her writing style, again, is quite idiosyncratic. It's a little bit difficult to follow, but it also reflects her peculiar genius in the way she was forging these new paths of insight, which then Waldo was able to often extend and publish. Though I'll play that. He was a genius in his own right, but he owes also a lot of early inspiration to his aunt. There are also ways in which her independence kept her from being fully comfortable in either the traditional Orthodox camp or the new progressive transcendentalist movement of her nephew. She was too innovative, too free-spirited to be fully comfortable among the Calvinists, but there were also aspects of traditional Christian theology that she continued to value that kept her from fully embracing the transcendentalism of her nephew. In many ways, she belonged to both sides and to neither. This dynamic eventually contributed to a growing divide between Mary and Waldo, but even as the two were never as close in later years as they were in his childhood and his early adulthood, her almanac continued to influence him throughout his life. I'll also share just one famous story from near the end of Mary's life. One evening, Bronson Alcott was hosting a conversation on the topic of the private life at Waldo's house. Waldo himself was away lecturing. Among those present, in addition to Mary, were Henry David Thoreau, his sister Sophia, and many other usual suspects from transcendentalist circles. And when one man in attendance proceeded to hijack the conversation and mansplain to everyone, right, and pontificate about moral relativism in a way such that neither Alcott nor Thoreau could mitigate, Mary intervened. Here's a description of what ensued as recorded by the journalist Franklin Sanborn, who was also part of the Transcendentalist movement. He says that rising from her chair on the west side of the room and turning her oddly garnished head towards the south side where the offender smilingly sat, she clasped her little wrinkled hands and raised them toward the black band at her left temple, a habit that she had when she was feeling deeply moved, and began to answer to those doctrines of Satan, as she thought of them. She expressed her amazement that any man should denounce the moral law, the only tie of society except religion, which she saw the speaker had made no claim. She referred him to his Bible and to Dr. Samuel Clarke, one of her great influences from childhood. She denounced him personally in the most racy terms. She did not cross the room and shake him, as Sanborn says, as some author not an eyewitness has fancied, but she retained her position. She sat down quietly when she had finished and was complimented by the smiling target of her words, who then, perhaps for the first time, had felt the force of her untaught rhetoric. So her rhetoric may not have been formally taught, but a lifetime of self-learning had made her a formidable interlocutor. At the end of her life, Mary had also become increasingly involved in the abolitionist movement, and both the abolitionist movement, the anti-slavery movement itself, as well as women's leadership in that movement, gave her new hope for an increasingly equal role for women in the future. And although Mary was increasingly ill toward the end of her life, she was likely well enough on New Year's Day, 1863, to comprehend the sea change of President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation taking effect and beginning to reshape American culture. Mary died a few months later on May 1st, 1863, at the age of 88. 6 years after Mary's death, when Waldo himself was 65 and toward the end of his public speaking career, one of the last lectures he ever wrote was in her honor. He titled it Amita, which is Latin for aunt. Years later, he had written a series of biographical essays on what he called representative men, meaning exemplary archetypes of their time and place, these representative men. At that time, all of his examples were famous European men. With Amita, he expanded his scope to include Mary. He wrote, "It is a representative life, such as could hardly have appeared outside of New England, of an age now past and of which I think no types survive. Perhaps I deceive myself and overestimate its interests, but to me it has a value like which readers found in Madame Guerin and Rahel Varhagen in Eugene de Guerin. It is purely original and hardly admits a duplicate, and marks, then it has the fruit of Calvinism and New England, and marks the precise time when the power of the old creed yielded to the influence of modern science and humanity." So here we see Waldo putting Mary in the same class as three famous women, a heretical French mystic, a German writer, and another French mystic known as Mary was, primarily through her journals and letters. And Waldo was far from Mary's only public admirer. Elizabeth Peabody, who I mentioned earlier, also expressed her esteem for Mary. Elizabeth both celebrated the ways that Waldo had extended the sort of Emersonian talent that he had inherited from his aunt. Even she also lamented the ways that Mary's talent was in many ways buried to far too great an extent because of her gender. In 1910, a young Virginia Woolf, only in her late 20s at the time, also became aware of Mary's genius and influence on Waldo, and Woolf incorporated her insights about Mary into a study of, quote, the creative life and domestic contraction women. On this Mother's Day, the life of Mary Moody Emerson is an invitation to honor those of our foremothers who have taught us to question received tradition and to pay attention to the wisdom of our own firsthand experience, what we know as true because we've experienced it for ourselves. In that spirit, I invite you to rise in body or spirit as we sing together a hymn, number 352, Find the Stillness, a hymn that honors the inner journey that Mary Moody Emerson knew well, a journey that is often possible only in solitude.